Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. Welcome to Left Side of the Aisle. I'm Larry Erickson, your host. And for the next half hour, I'm going to be talking about stuff that I think should be of interest to you. I hope it is, and that maybe you want to do something about. If you have any comments, questions, or reactions, as always, my personal email is whoviating, WHOVIATING @AOL.com. And if you didn't get that, go to my website, Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. You can get the email address from there, or if you prefer, you can leave a comment there. If you do send me email, as always, please include something in the subject line and make it clear this is not spam. And be a little patient about getting an answer because I'm really bad about answering email, but you will get an answer. All right. So with that, starting as I try to do every week with some bit of good news, I'm going to start with sort of good news, and you'll see why I say sort of. The Keystone XL pipeline. This is the one that's intended to carry tar sands from, tar sands, these are about the dirtiest, most polluting way to get oil there is. And this pipeline was to carry tar sands from Canada to Texas, where they would be shipped to other countries for sale. Well, the Keystone XL pipeline is still on hold. Looked for a while like it might not be. The House of Representatives, striving mightily to prove that it is reactionary, not merely right-wing, approved a bill to push forward the pipeline. And for a time, it looked like the Senate was going to do the same, all because of Mary Landrieu. Mary Landrieu is a Democratic senator from Louisiana. She's facing a runoff election on December 6th, which she is widely expected to lose because her opponent is and consistently has been ahead in the opinion polls. So in an attempt to make herself look good in Louisiana, she co-sponsored the Senate version of this bill. And proving again, yet again, that partisanship is more important than policy and that ego trumps the environment, the Senate Democratic leadership urged all the Democrats in the Senate to vote for the bill in order to slightly improve her dim chances of retaining her Senate seat. This is even though if she did retain her Senate seat, the Goppers would still have a majority in the Senate. In other words, what they're saying is, she's a colleague. She's a member of our insular elite. We've got to help her. No price to the environment is too great to avoid helping Mary Landrieu have some vague possibility of keeping her Senate seat. Well, the hard reality of the Senate is that it still takes 60 votes to pass anything these days. It's got to be a filibuster-proof majority. And a few days before the vote, Mary Landrieu appeared to have a solid 59 votes. And when the vote came on Tuesday afternoon, that's what she got, 59. The days of politicking and pressure from the majority leadership failed to move a single member. And I've spoken against this pipeline a number of times here, so obviously I think that's good news. Why it's just sort of good news is that this is only temporary. The newly elected Gopper-ruled Senate is going to take the issue up again in January when the Senate reconvenes, and they'll probably be able to push it through. Which means that the focus will be, as it actually has been all along, on Barack Obama, who will finally have to decide if all his environmental talk is anything more than that. Frankly, I'm not sure it is, but I'm not sure it isn't either. So we'll have to keep up the pressure. All right, another bit of good news, 2 quick notes about the ongoing battle for marriage justice. A couple of weeks ago, I noted that South Carolina was the only state in the Fourth Circuit that was still enforcing a ban on same-sex marriage, claiming that the decision by the appeals court somehow didn't apply to South Carolina. Well, no more. On November 12th, Federal District Court Judge Richard Mark Gergel ruled that the state's ban, South Carolina's ban on same-sex marriage, is unconstitutional in line with the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals precedent. Now, the decision has been stayed until November 20th to give the state a chance to appeal, which it probably will, to the same court that already threw these things out in the first place. And another bit of good news on this same front, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals may have, as it did, upheld Michigan's marriage discrimination against same-sex couples, But a federal judge ruled that employee benefits is not about marriage, and so said that the state law in Michigan, which bans the same-sex partners of state employees from receiving benefits, is unconstitutional. Part of the strength of the case here was the fact that several municipalities in Michigan were already giving such benefits, and so the law had the effect of stripping away benefits from people who already had them. And legally, it's always harder to defend stripping away something that people already have than it is to defend them not getting it in the first place. So, all right, next up. This is a purely personal rant, just frankly because this is just something that just ticks me off, and it just did recently, so that's why I'm bringing it up. Recently on this show, I said that there's no one quicker to whine about how unfair and mean you are. No one is quicker to wrap themselves in the mantle of the oppressed, silenced victim, than, here's a little Freudian slip for you, the oppressed, silenced victim than a right-winger who was losing an argument. I was wrong about that. It's not only when they're losing an argument. It's all the time. No group of any sort, with the possible exception of the rich, has a greater sense of entitlement, than the right wing, a greater sense that everything has to be arranged for their benefit. And if it's not, it's just evil and unfair, and you're a great big meanie. I was recently watching the station here that I call home, and I saw a show on produced by somebody in a neighboring town. The host is a very conservative commentator, and he was grousing about how liberals control everything. And part of his argument for this was, he said, there's a station in a neighboring town where, he said, the liberal side of the aisle is on 3 times as much as I am. This, according to him, was evidence of unforgivable liberal bias on the part of that other station. Well, in terms of actual airtime, which would seem to be the important metric here, in terms of actual airtime, I am on more than he is, although it's closer to 2.5 times and 3 times, but I'm not going to quibble about that. Here's the thing. On the station that he calls home, he's on 5 hours a week. I'm on for 30 minutes. He's on 10 times longer than I am. But that was no indication of bias at that station. Oh, no, it can't be. Because when the difference benefits him, it's not bias. When it doesn't, it is. And this is something that's routine among right-wingers. And I raise this whole thing in order to give you another example that just came up. In every state in the country except Maine and Nebraska, states go with the winner-take-all approach to the Electoral College. That approach has been pretty consistent across U.S. history. But in recent years, Republicans in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Wisconsin, have each considered changing those rules to a method that would apportion their state's electoral votes based on which presidential candidate won each congressional district in that state. They ultimately all backed off, but Michigan's Republicans are now thinking of trying to push through a measure through the state legislature's lame duck session in order to do exactly that. Now, the thing is, all these 5 states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Wisconsin, and Michigan, what have all those 5 states got in common? You got it. Democratic presidential candidates have been winning there. You're not winning? Change the rules. Because everything has to be arranged for their benefit. Like a grasping 2-year-old screeching, mine, mine, they don't know how to function any other way, except that everything has to work in their favor. They don't know how to function otherwise. And frankly, that's really quite sad. All right. This is something else. I've done this a couple of times here before, the last couple of years. I suppose you could call it a little bit of a tradition, but here's the deal. Thanksgiving is on its way. So gather around, kiddies. I'm going to tell you the real story, the actual based on historical evidence story of the first Thanksgiving. by which, of course, I do mean the event that took place in Plymouth in the fall of 1621, which has become the basis for our national holiday. Now, one of the reasons I do this every year is that it is truly amazing just how much misinformation, mythology, and general muddle-headedness there is out there about this. And I like to try to bring some hard historical reality to the discussion, which we will do right after the break. And we're back. All right, so to start our Thanksgiving tale, consider this quote. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men unfowling, that we might after a special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much as fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest, their greatest King Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom we for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation, and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers in our plenty. All right, that quote comes from a letter dated December 11, 1621. It was written to a loving and old friend in England by Edward Winslow, a Mayflower passenger who was a leader in the early years of the colony. It was contained in a book published in England in 1622 under the rather ponderous title of A Relation or Journal of the Beginnings and Proceedings of the English Plantation Settled at Plymouth in New England by certain English adventurers, both merchants and others. It's now known popularly by the rather less cumbersome title of Mort's Relation, and it consists of eyewitness accounts of various events during the first year of the settlement. All right, here's why that letter is important here. It is the only contemporaneous account of that, what we know as the first Thanksgiving, that is known to exist. The only other even near contemporaneous account comes from William Bradford, who was a longtime governor of the place, who wrote about it in his journal about 10 to 12 years after the fact. Even there, he just sort of brushes by it. This is what he said, I'm quoting. They now began to gather in the small harvest they had, and to fit up their houses against the winter, being all well recovered in health and strength that had all things in good plenty. For as some were thus employed in affairs abroad, others are exercised in fishing, about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took good store, of which every family had its portion. All the summer there was no want, and now began to come in store of fowl as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they came first, but afterwards decreased by degrees. And besides waterfowl there was great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison, etc. Besides, they had about a peck of meal a week to a person, or now since harvest, Indian corn to that proportion, which made many afterwards write so large of their plenty here to their friends in England, which were not feigned but true reports. Okay, that's it. That's all of it. That's what the entire first Thanksgiving story is built on. Everything else is speculation, interpretation, and guesswork. Some of that informed, a lot of it not. Now, there are some additional things we can tell from the accounts. For one thing, based on other references in those same sources, we know that the event took place after September 18th and before November 9th. Most likely, it was in late September or the beginning of October, because that would have been shortly after harvest. In considering the event, the first thing to know is that this was not a Thanksgiving as somebody of the time would have understood it. And the period of Thanksgiving was a religious occasion, a day set aside for prayer, to give thanks to God for some special and unexpected blessing. Such days would occur occasionally as the need arose, so to plan for one in advance, especially to, as we do now, plan for one every year, would have been regarded as an incredible and gross presumption on God's will and God's intentions. So what this was instead was a very traditional, very secular, very English harvest feast. It was a celebration of a good harvest that was common in England, and at those celebrations it was customary to invite those who had been helpful to you with regard to your fields over the course of the year, which is very likely why the natives were there, because they had been helpful. True, the settlers didn't have a good harvest. Remember, Bradford called it small, but they had a harvest, which undoubtedly raised everyone's spirits and gave everybody a sense that, yeah, we're going to make it. Which was reason enough for a celebration, especially considering what they had been through in that year. Now, by the way, I want to make a quick aside to explain a rather subtle point more closely. Europeans of the 17th century, especially these sort of religiously conservative Europeans who were, such as the leaders of the plantation were, they didn't make the sort of clear distinctions that we do today between what is religious and what is secular. The sense of a feeling of an awareness of, a sense of the hand of God or the will of God in all events was much more central to their lives and their minds than it would be for the vast majority of us today. What that means here is that the 1621 harvest feast would surely have included prayers of thanks to God, perhaps a sermon from the religious leader, Elder William Brewster. These would have been significant features of the event, just as prayer was a common feature of their everyday lives, from meals to musket drills to mucking about in the fields tending their crops. However, they would not have regarded this as a day of thanksgiving or as a religious occasion as they understood the meanings that we put on them. The prayers would have been significant features of the event. They would not have been the central features. They would not have been the driving force, the focus of the event. Celebration was. Put another way, if we had been able to witness this 1621 event, to our modern eyes, there very likely would have been more than enough praying, giving thanks, and singing of psalms and hymns to make it look like a religious or at least religiously inspired event. But to a person of the 17th century, it would have looked about as secular as things got. Okay, anyway, back to our story. As for the eternal question of what did they eat, we can be confident in some things. We can be confident they had fowl, such as duck or goose. Remember, Bradford sent 4 men on fowling in preparation. Quite possibly, they had turkey, of which they took good store, Bradford says. They would have had fish, especially cod or bass, and quite possibly deer. Now, another side here, having to do with use of historical sources, and why I say quite possibly, dear. One of the things that is important to do is to use your historical sources without running too far ahead of them, which is a fault of which the revisionist histories are consistently guilty. Winslow says the natives went out and got 5 deer, which they bestowed on our governor and others. But the thing is, from his account, we can't tell if those deers were brought soon enough to be slaughtered, to be butchered, dressed, cooked, and presented as part of the feast, or were they brought later as a sort of thank you, like a reciprocal gift for having been entertained and feasted. Bradford's mention of venison doesn't resolve things, because in the period, venison meant hunted meat, which includes, obviously, but is not restricted to deer. So which is why we can say they quite possibly had deer, but we can't say it definitively. Another real possibility is lobster and other shellfish. In that letter from Winslow that I quoted, he says elsewhere in that letter that they're abundant in the area, as are, by the way, eels, of which they could take a hogshead in a night, he says. And by the way, if you say eels, ooh, realize that an English person of the 17th century would say they're just another kind of fish. And by the way, Winslow says they could fill a hogshead in a night. A hogshead is a cask that holds 63 gallons of liquid. So yeah, Winslow was probably exaggerating. He was like that. All right, beyond that, we can argue reasonably for some other foods, such as a sort of pie made from squash from their gardens, sweetened with dried fruit, which they would have brought from England, salads from other stuff in their gardens, and a sort of coarse cornbread. Very likely, water was the only beverage. their supply of barley would be limited. Winslow says the English grains, which would include wheat, rye, and oats, as well as barley, he said they grew indifferent good, so they wouldn't have had much barley, and there's no mention of hops. Okay, no hops, no beer, not much barley, not much ale. And even if they did have a supply of barley, it's questionable if they would have had enough time to brew it before this feast occurred. So they might have had some ale. They might have had some wine, which they would have brought over from England to be saved for a special occasion. But the fact is, we don't know, and water was very likely. It was at the very least the primary drink. All right, so that's pretty much it. Pretty much everything we can or reasonably can argue about the event. And that's not much to build a whole mythology on, is it? Even so, that drove the kind of pap we got fed as school children, marked by images of picnic tables laden with turkey, mashed potatoes, and apple pie, surrounded by natives dressed like they just came from the Great Plains, and pilgrims dressed in fashions of the 1690s. And that same sparseness of detail, and one of the reasons I go through this every year, that same sparseness of detail is probably a good part of the reason why the same event provides so much latitude to those who want to replace the childhood and childish image of noble settlers and savage natives with one of noble natives and savage settlers, who every year, regularly as clockwork, treat us to the historical revisionism that has become as traditional as turkey and cranberry sauce. In place of the happy talk mythologies of peace, love, and harmony we were spoon-fed as children, we find people snarling out dark tales of drunken, murderous, bloodthirsty settlers facing with natives, crashing the party, who did it in such numbers because they were afraid that otherwise they'd be kidnapped or killed. It's a vision that, as much as the earlier one, is an attempt to overwrite history with ideology. It is, in other words, bunk. In point of historical fact, relations between Plymouth and the neighboring natives were reasonably good for several decades. There were stresses and strains and disruptions, yes, but for the most part, they managed to keep together the peace agreement and mutual defense pact that they signed in the spring of 1621. Things got gradually worse, and I won't go into all the reasons why, except to note that the biggest two were population pressure and disputes over land. Those disputes were rooted in vast cultural differences between the English and the natives. The native culture had no concept of land ownership. It's not, the thing is, it's not just that the natives would say, oh, we don't own the land, or that we all own the land, or the Great Spirit owns the land. No, the idea of land as a possession did not exist. To the natives, to own something meant you could pick it up and carry it away with you. How could you own something if you have to leave it behind anytime you go anywhere? Which makes sense for a semi-nomadic people who live in one area part of the year and another area part of the year. It makes perfect sense. But of course, to any European, land ownership is a common, everyday notion. And this difference in cultural values was a major source of conflict. The peace finally, inevitably, irrevocably broke down, but that was in 1675, more than 50 years after the so-called First Thanksgiving. The point here is that at that time, in the fall of 1621, native settler relations were good. In fact, that Winslow letter I quoted earlier, the very next sentences of that letter are these. Quoting, "We have found the Indians very faithful in their covenant of peace with us, very loving and ready to pleasure us. We often go to them and they come to us. Some of us have been 50 miles by land in the country with them." Winslow also says that all the other native leaders in the vicinity have made peace with Plymouth on the same terms as Massasoit, as a result of which he asserts there is now great peace among the Indians themselves, which was not formerly. He goes on to say that, quoting again, "We for our parts walk as peaceably and safely in the wood as in the highways of England. We entertain them familiarly in our houses, and they as friendly bestowing their venison upon us. They are a people without any religion or knowledge of God, yet very trusty, quick of apprehension, ripe-witted, just." And just to be certain you know, trusty means trustworthy, not trusting. And quick of apprehension does not mean quick to be apprehensive. It means quick to understand, quick to grasp the meaning of something. Now, frankly, those descriptions do not sound like bloodthirsty settlers eager to kill natives, or natives who feared contact with those same settlers, or felt they had to display massive force in order to be captured, avoid being captured or killed. If you're still unconvinced of that rather, consider that in June of 1621, 3 or 4 months before the first Thanksgiving, so-called, the town felt it necessary to send a message to Massasoit requesting that he restrain his people from coming to the settlement in such numbers. This is a quote from Mort's relation. Quoting, "But whereas his people came very often and very many together unto us, bringing for the most part their wives and children with them, they were welcome, yet we being as strangers as yet at Pawtuxet, alias New Plymouth, and not knowing how our corn might prosper, we could no longer give them such entertainment as we had done and as we desired still to do." That's how afraid the natives were of these settlers. Assigning the role of angel or demon to either side is trash. Neither of these people were either. Neither were saints, neither were demons. So frankly, I reject this revisionist history. In fact, I resent the revisionist history. I resent it first because it's lousy history. It's based on ideology, not information. It looks to satisfy the demands of politics, not of scholarship. And it's every bit as full of false tales and mythology as the nonsense and pap it looks to replace. Plymouth in the fall of 1621 was a scene of genuinely peaceful and friendly relations, of good feeling between English settlers and their nearest native neighbors. That so-called first Thanksgiving was a moment of celebration when everyone on both sides, even if they were still wary of each other, everyone on both sides was thinking, yeah, this is going to work out. Now, that wasn't going to happen. It was a false hope, even a foolish one. And it was a brief enough moment, lasting even by a generous interpretation, no more than a few decades. And it was a rare enough moment in our nation's history of cruelty and genocide toward the native peoples of this continent that while the first Thanksgiving shouldn't be a source of happy ever after, why can't we get along talk, neither is there any need to co-opt it into the service of ideologically driven revisionism. Because that moment of hope did exist. And frankly, I resent the attempts to strip away that one moment of hope in pursuit of a modern political agenda. I remember a friend of mine saying some time ago, that, talking about the urge to find angelic forces in the world. That is the seeming need of many of us to fix on some group, some motion, some group, some movement that we convince ourselves is utterly pure in its motives and actions. In our attempts to find some better balance of our understanding of what was done to the Native Americans, the cruelties inflicted on them, the racism and bigotry that targeted them, too many of us, in considering the Pilgrims of Plymouth, have simply chosen to swap one mythology for a perhaps more satisfying but still false one. Balance, it seems, is still a long way off. Anyway, I hope you enjoy your Turkey Day. I hope you have time to spend with your friends or family, or better yet, both. And I hope you can understand why I celebrate the day, not really as an expression of thankfulness, either for the past or the present, but as an expression of hope for the future. That hope may prove to be as foolish as the hope of 1621 was, and I often think that it is. But the fact remains that hope is the one absolute, indispensable requirement for making that future a better one. That's it for us. We will see you next week. You have the best week you possibly can. Peace.